I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome back to Conflict Uncovered. It's been a while. We've had some distracting times. A war here, barrages there, alerts. But we're back, and hopefully we'll be putting out a much more regular week, every week, or maybe twice a week, maybe even more, broadcast podcast. I'm joined by a good friend, Don Uslan, who will be doing at least a series, maybe an indefinite series with us. Don and I have known each other for more years than either of us should admit. And I'm going to let him introduce himself before we get down to the business of talking about the campaign with Iran. So, Don, welcome. And a little about you.
Hi, Elliot. Thank you. Thank you so much. Elliot and I go back over 26 years when I first came here with the Jewish day school visit to Israel, and he was our tour guide. My name is Don, but in Israel, I'm called Ze'ev, which is my Hebrew name. And briefly, just about me, I'm an Oleh of 7 years, born, raised in Los Angeles, lived in Seattle for 40 years. And my profession is as a medical psychotherapist. I'm semi-retired, but that means that I see things in the complexity and depth, but oftentimes simplicity eludes me, which is one of the reasons I'm friends with Elliot, because he can make things clear and simple, where I tend to make things complicated and overly depth. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity.
Great. I'm looking forward to having these talks with you. I was mulling the idea of renaming the podcast The Psych and the Psycho, but I think we'll stay with Conflict Uncovered just because of the brand. So, Don, you're in Jerusalem. I'm up north. We're enjoying the attention of Iran on a regular basis with sirens and alerts. I'm also receiving a bit from Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I'm in the overlap. I get some from the east and some from the north, but we're all going through a very similar experience, and there are all sorts of questions raised about this. So one of the things that we talked about and that we'll be doing is I want you to take the position of the above average person out there, going through it, seeing it. You're also, I know, in contact with a lot of colleagues in the United States. What are the issues that people are looking at and facing with this quandary?
So just a wee bit of context. Today, Thursday, in the last 2.5 hours, we've had 5 alerts, 3 going into the bomb shelter, which is more than we live in South Jerusalem near the old city. And it's the most intense that we've had. The issue for us, is the Americans, Canadians, some Europeans I know can't understand not only the daily experience, such as I just described, but the, for lack of a terrible word, context of it. They get news that is at best superficial and at worst biased and incomplete. And some struggle, some have their heads in the sand. And, I kind of view it as my job to be as clear and as informative as I can. So the question, Elliot, is what is it with the news services, be it outside of here, in the diaspora, or here, that is unable to convey not only 5 bomb shelter warnings, not only lovely men and women going to serve uh, and protect us. Why can't they get it? What are they all missing?
I think they're missing a few things, and I'm going to differentiate between the American media and the Israeli media, although paradoxically, from different angles, they have certain things in common. The American media, by intent, and the Israeli media, by consequence, are putting out a picture essentially of defeat. The American media is doing it in large part because they're anti-Trump, and anything that Trump does has to be shown to be wrong. The Israeli media is doing it as a consequence because it's focusing, I would say, overly focusing on what's happening in Israel with the missile attacks uh, and the the occasional hits. And I don't want to belittle this, and I want to be clear, from the outset, pieces or missiles themselves, when they hit, are causing damage. They're inflicting casualties, injured, and in some cases killed. And I don't want the rest of my comments to sound like I'm poo-pooing that and saying that's not serious. But I think that there are two levels that need to be looked at here, at least two levels. And one of them is the individual personal one, which is what I just related. But the other one is a kind of macro national one of a country at war. And it's callous, but war, it's the nature of war that when you talk about things like damage and casualties, you speak about it in relative or contextual terms. So, first of all, the media has, even before we get into bias, the media has a technical problem, and that is that there are no pictures coming out of what we're doing in Iran and very little of what we're doing in Lebanon against Hezbollah. In other words, occasionally we'll see a picture of a building in the Hezbollah center in the Dahya in Beirut being hit, but that's not much of a graphic, and frankly, nobody cares. It's a building. It's much more focused to talk about, from the Israeli perspective, for example, a missile hitting in Tel Aviv and showing damage in Tel Aviv. That speaks to people more, and the media sees that as a story that it can get its teeth into. And here I'm talking about purely technical terms of a story. So they're going to go with it. They've got people on the ground. They can interview people who are there. They can build a story around it. When the Basij headquarters in Tehran is destroyed, which is a very, very significant target, because at one point or another, we'll talk about the goals of the war and the possible regime change that we're hoping the Iranians will do for themselves. Taking out the headquarters of the Basij is a great step in that direction. But there are no pictures. There's nobody to interview. There's no story. It's a one-liner. Oh, by the way, the Israeli Air Force took out the headquarters of the Basij in Tehran. So that's sort of the media context problem. But I want to take, yes.
A related question. I read uh, somewhere in reliable news that we've taken out 80 to 90% of blank missile production, missiles. The Americans have done this and this. Why wouldn't that resonate as a fact, as a contribution to the lack of pictures, for example?
Okay, because once again, the news today is heavily visual, and they can put it in as a one-liner somewhere in the story. Its impact on the receiving end is also not felt. And here there's a lot of what could have been, what would have been if not, that's lost in the actual reporting. Mm, Let me explain what I mean. I'll use the Hezbollah example, but I'll shift it to Iran as well. I was asked a question last night in a briefing that I gave. How long are they going to keep firing missiles? And because we're constantly taking out rockets and missiles and launchers and all of that. How come they're still shooting? So the answer is they're going to keep doing it indefinitely. Sorry to say, and I'll explain why. We have to start with what they had, what they have done in the past, and what they were planning to do, in contrast to what's actually happening. If you remember, the 12-day, what's called the 12-day war. I call it the 12-day campaign because our war with Iran started, and America's war as well, started in 1979 when Khomeini came to power. The 12 days was a campaign in that war, just as now we're in this campaign, in this ongoing war. But back then, and even in the missile attacks prior to the 12 days, the Iranians were firing 80, 90, 100 ballistic missiles at a time at Israel, in addition to cruise missiles and drones. And we forget that. Most of them were intercepted. Some of them fell. The Americans were involved as well. Apparently, the Jordanians were involved. The Brits were involved. In other words, there was a massive effort to prevent them from landing, but they were firing close to 100 missiles simultaneously. And today, on a bad day, they're firing 10.
There
That's a
seems to
huge
be great.
on the day. On
There
the
seems
day,
to be a greater accuracy, a greater impact this time than
no,
the 12-day war within the war.
no. I think that's faulty memory. I think that first of all, we're talking about missiles that are what are referred to in the technical terminology. These are statistical weapons. In other words, whether they fall in a park or on a street or on a building is purely statistics. So if they get lucky, they hit a building or a bomb shelter, as they did last week, 2 weeks ago in Beit Shemesh, or they fall in an open field. They're not that accurate. They're not precision accurate. They're accurate enough, but they're not precision accurate. That's number one. Number two, the fact is that now they are firing one or two or three at a time at a target as opposed to 50 at a target. That means they don't have the capability to launch massive strikes. They might have a few hundred left, but if they fire 100 at a time, they have 3 attacks and then they're out. They would much rather, and I think their strategy from their point of view is correct, they would much rather harass us with multiple attacks a day of 1 or 2 or 3 at a time at Tel Aviv, at Jerusalem, at Haifa, and send millions of people into bomb shelters, especially at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then again at 3, and then again at 4. That has far more impact than if they launched one single attack and then they were done with it. They also know that the Israeli interceptor system will stop 10, 15, or 20 just as well as it'll stop 1 or 2. Why waste 20 missiles when the 2 will do the exact same, will have the exact same effect on the population? Let's also keep in mind, actually, I have to say this as an aside because I read this in social media and I find it extremely amusing. The Iron Dome is being written off by many as a total failure. I don't know if you've seen those reports.
No, to me, although it's expensive, it's tremendous success. I hear the boom booms
So,
overhead
so
frequently.
the boom booms that you're hearing are not from the Iron Dome. I want to state explicitly and clearly and unequivocally that the Iron Dome has failed to intercept 100% of the Iranian ballistic missiles. In other words, it has not intercepted a single Iranian ballistic missile since the outbreak of the war. Zero. 0.00. The Iron Dome has not worked against Iranian ballistic missiles. You know why? Because it's not an anti-ballistic missile system. It's an anti-rocket system. It's not
Uh,
used against the ballistic missiles. The Iron Dome has no place in the ballistic missile exchange.
okay,
The
can you please
arrow,
define
what
the
you're
difference?
hearing is the arrow.
Okay. Can you explain briefly for those of us who are not in the know the difference between a rocket and a missile? Because to me, they're like, oh, they'll
Sure.
kill. Um,
Look, on the receiving end, there's not much of a difference. I'm joking. There is a difference. The rockets are being fired by Hezbollah. Some of them are long range and actually are reaching Tel Aviv. Most of them are hitting the Galilee, and we're on the where I live is on the extreme end of where they're firing into the Galilee. They're firing primarily short range along the border, Nahariya, Tzfat, Kiryat Shmona, that belt along the border. Those rockets are roughly, on the average, 5 inches in diameter, and they stand about 3 or 4 feet tall when they're standing up. A ballistic missile looks like a flying silo. It's huge. It's
We see pictures of the
three, four
remnants.
feet, five,
Right.
right, 5 feet in diameter. The range is from Iran, talking about thousands of kilometers, and carrying up to a 1-ton warhead or cluster warheads that we're seeing being used over Tel Aviv, which incidentally are a blatant, unequivocal violation of international law. You heard the UN's condemnation yesterday, right?
No, I didn't.
No, because
I
of
was in the
course not,
bomb
because there
shelter.
wasn't any.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, thank you. Very good.
Okay, okay. The rocket's flight is typically 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds. The ballistic missile's flight is 10, 12, 15 minutes. We're talking about two very, very different weapons. So the Iron Dome is a small, relatively small, anti-rocket, quick fire, lock, shoot, and take out kind of a weapon, where the arrow, which is what you're hearing in your interceptions, I hear them also. But I have both. By the way, I think you saw I put up on. If you didn't, you can go and look. A couple of days ago, I put a clip up on Facebook of the Iron Dome intercepting 5 rockets above my head.
Yes, and I made funny remarks to it, like that's the
Yes,
first
you
thing
did. Okay,
over your head, right?
that's right. So the Iron Dome works, and it works against rockets, and it works very well against rockets. It's the arrow that's being used against the ballistic missiles. It's an entirely different system. In both cases, and I think this is a very important point, in both cases, their advertised success anticipation is 90 plus percent. That means that statistically, and I don't want to go deep into statistics here, general statistics, that means that 1 out of 10 is going to get through. Now, of course, we know that since each of these is an independent event, you could have something like what happened last week, where 2 ballistic missiles got through in one night, one to Arad and one to Dimona. That wasn't a failure. If you look at the overall number that's been fired since the beginning of the war, the arrow is still working at over 90%. The Iron Dome is still working at over 90%. But
Let me ask you a question that I hope is
yes,
relevant. Then why is it reported? For what reason is it reported that the Iron Dome is not successful? When you're distinguishing, are these lack of good reporting? Is there intentional
yes.
misunderstandings?
Okay, so let's start with ignorance. Some of it is malice. In other words, there is an entire industry out there on social media trying to show that Israel, that Tel Aviv has been reduced to rubble four
Right,
times already since this
right,
war began.
right.
Okay. The Israeli pilots are refusing to fly for fear of flying over Iran. I can give you how many times has Netanyahu been killed in the past 2 weeks? So there's an industry. That's number one. Number two, there's a lack of belief, and I think that this is endemic, particularly in America. I only believe my local podcaster. The governments always lie. Everything's a cover up. Uh, conspiracy theory has become the method. There is a refusal to accept Israeli success, and maybe in the minutes that I have left to conclude this segment with a couple of these ideas, but I have to tell you a personal anecdote from uh, over 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I had a group that I was guiding and teaching of ROTC from MIT. Now, first of all, hint, MIT did not have Army or Marine ROTC. It was all Navy and Air Force, tech people, and they were accompanied by their instructors who were grad students at MIT. And this one lovely young naval officer and I were sitting one evening, and he says, we have a professor at MIT, this is 12 years ago, who claims that the Israelis are lying about the Iron Dome. It's a myth. It's a lie. He did all the calculations multiple times and concluded that it is physically and technically impossible for an anti-rocket interceptor to intercept a rocket. Why? Because the closing speed of the two coming together, in other words, if an interceptor goes against the nose of the rocket, their combined speed is so high that there's no way they can hit it accurate. We're talking
However,
about thousands of miles per hour.
however,
Okay, and he's a professor at MIT, right? Aerospace, missiles, whatever. So I said, it's interesting because he's right. His calculations are 100% correct. But as it turns out, the Israeli designers did the same calculations. And they concluded that you can't take out a rocket head to head. So what the Iron Dome does is that it passes the rocket, it makes a U-turn, and overtakes it from behind. So the actual closing speed at impact is close to zero.
okay. A, it's an example of over-intellectualization. Two, is an example
It's
of
an example. Go on.
somebody who didn't get their hands dirty. Is that an example of some form of anti-Semitism? Not to overuse the word, or just simply
I don't want to go to
arrogance.
anti-Semitism on this one. We will. Not on this one. Here I'm going to say anti-Israel. Here I'm going to say that he apparently started from the conclusion that the Israelis are liars, and then did his calculations to prove his conclusion. Rather than ask, okay, if it's working, how do they make it work? And I think we're seeing a batch of that out there for some of the reasons that I mentioned. I think there are other reasons. But the bottom line, I think, to conclude here, is that what we're seeing, and we talked about Iran. Let me quickly interject. Hezbollah, before October 7th, we know that their planned doctrine was to fire 4,000 rockets a day into Israel, and they had the arsenal to do it. Today, on a bad day, they're firing a few dozen. Now, once again, here's where, looking at it from two perspectives. When you're on the receiving end of a few dozen rockets, it's not a pleasant experience. But a few dozen rockets is also within, and again, not all at once, a few dozen over the course of the day, is well within the capability of the Iron Dome to engage most of them. If they were firing 200, 300 at a time, 20 times a day, the Iron Dome would not be able to intercept them. Their impact rate would be not at less than 10%, but it would be at 30, 40, 50, 60%, and we would be in an entirely different place. And this is where the two perspectives, right, the being on the receiving end on the one hand, but looking at it kind of globally from a war perspective on another hand, are two very, very different things. And I think we have to look at this as a war. And I'll conclude with this idea also. I refuse to see Israel, with all of what we're getting now, as the victim in this. We are not the victim. We went after Iran legitimately, with total justification. They are the enemy. They needed to be dealt with, and we're dealing with them. But did we really expect that they were going to sit back and take it without firing at us? In other words, what Iran is doing, and I'm going to keep sort of on the general context, what Iran is doing is what you would expect from a country that's being bombarded. The fact that they're using cluster munitions on civilian populations is an absolute war crime. But that they are, and that they're firing missiles at a civilian population. but that they are responding violently to the attacks on them, and that we are on the receiving end of that violent response, I refuse to see ourselves as victims of that. That is part of the calculated price of going to war with an enemy that has sworn our destruction.
Thank you. I comprehend this. At a future conversation, given what you just said, I'd like to have a conversation about how it is that many Americans, Europeans, see that this war was unnecessary, that it could have been dealt with by negotiation, as people laugh at that. And I'd like to be able to, in some future conversation, continue with that part of it.
Let's do that next. Our next conversation should be on that.
Thank you.
Don, thanks so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to doing this. I think we're going to have a lot of fun, and maybe both of us will learn something from each other.
Thank you, Elliot. And may we have no more bomb shelters today or in the future. This
amen.
year in Jerusalem.
From your mouth to the Ayatollah's ears.
Yes, what once were. Thank you, Elliot. Appreciate it.
Thank you to all of our listeners. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, stay connected, stay involved, and until next time. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.